Hi, I'm here to talk about animation for a game I'm working on. It's called World to the West. You've probably never heard of it because it's not been released yet. And I work for a very small indie game company from Norway. I'm very happy that I get to be here and among all these talented animators and talking about my animation. So before I start talking about animation, I would like to just introduce myself a little bit. My name is Aslak. I'm from Norway. So if I have a bit of an accent, you'll have to excuse me. I didn't start out in games when I started working. I was educated as an illustrator and graphic designer. And I started working actually in television with motion graphics and special effects. So, but after a few years, I got the opportunity to start a company with some friends. And we made a game called Teslagrad, which were released on several of the major consoles. It's a puzzle platformer. And now we're making a new game, which is what I'm here to talk about. So this image is, these are all my kids, the stuff that I've been working on. So since we're a small company, I fill several roles. So I work both as a character artist and an animator. But sort of animation is where I spend most of my time. We're a small team, 10 people. And we try to make games that sort of are in the same sort of style. And we have a motto for our games that's grim and whimsy, which is basically about contrast between like playful, colorful worlds and like a little bit darker subject matter. For example, World to the West that we're working on now touches on some themes like child labor and discrimination, but it's in a sort of humorous, darkly humorous way. And I want to show you some footage that's never been shown before of the game so that you can get an idea of what it is before I start talking about the animation. Right, so that was some game footage. I want to talk a little bit about our inspirations. Of course, it's inspired by a lot of Super Nintendo era top-down games. So the gameplay is seen from a top-down angle, but we use 3D graphics instead of sprites. But we are inspired by a lot of the, like I said, Super Nintendo era games like Mother 3, or Earthbound as it's known in the West, and of course Zelda, Legend of Zelda, but also things outside of games that our inspiration are like Belgian French comics and the characters of Osamu Tezuka and things like Asterix, if you know this. And we want to like make this sort of very playful visual style to work with. Before I get into the animation, I want to also mention, like, since we're a small team, there's a certain amount of constraints we've been working with and like fighting with to make the game work. We're a small team, so we have to like wear multiple hats. Like I've said, I perform several roles on the team. We have limited time, so we have to focus our work on like the most important parts. And we have like some technical limitations. We can't like take advantage of like the most modern technology. So on to the fun part, animation. I want to start talking a little bit about animation principles, because like the way I've sort of interpreted them to work on the game. For example, it was, in my opinion, like the most basic building blocks of animation for timing and spacing. Always use those principles to like determine early on the speed and size and weight of a character, and how that varies when the character speeds up. For example, this little creature here called a flail monk. When he gets agitated, he starts speeding up his motions and jumping higher and everything, and like stretching further. So it's you can see that he is a very light and sort of small character from his motions. And also try to use follow through and overlapping actions on some of our characters to add like believability. Because that principle adds, I think, a lot of layers to the animation that make it feel more physical. But I have sort of a love-hate relationship with this concept, because it takes so much time, or at least for me, it takes a lot of time. So I try to limit doing this only to places where I will have a lot of sort of exposure in the game, like main motions of a character. I will do overlapping action, like you see that her braids moving. I was just walking, the hood bouncing up and back and forth, her dress rotating, those kinds of things. I try to limit them to the places where like they will make the most impact. And for other animations, I usually just leave it alone. It's not ideal, but it sort of works, and it allows us to have those kinds of motions in the game. And I think they add a lot, even if they're not everywhere. And then there's a little bit about secondary actions, which I'll use a little bit, because I wanted to add facial animation to the game. And I think it adds a lot to the expressiveness of the characters, so that like when you have him, for example, this guy raising his hand, it would work fine without the face, but adding like facial animation to emphasize the move makes it more fun. So we spent some time building like a basic face rig that we use for all the characters. It's not always animated that much, but for like the most central emotes and movements, I use it quite a bit. Also try to use some squash and stretch, but I'm not a technical animator, so I struggle a bit with setting up rigs that actually do squash and stretch well. So the squash and stretch in the game is basically just bones moving apart. Like you can see in this guy here, his spine is stretching and contracting. And I was not, it doesn't do quite as much as I would like to. I can't do like the type of spline IK moving, like making arcs out of the squash and stretch, but I could do like a very basic form. But this is due to our technical limitations. I would really like to have a technical animator on our team. So the final thing I want to talk about is exaggeration. So exaggeration is great. I love it. It's like really why I enjoy animation that much, to just make characters that are bouncy and do strange things, and like do fun poses. And I think like it makes everything more interesting. Like this guy here, he's a small kid, so he has very fast motions, and I try to exaggerate like his up and down, jumping while he's running, and his hat is almost flying off his head. And I think the sort of exaggerated way everything is flapping makes him feel more characteristic, gives him more of a personality. But there is a danger to exaggeration that sort of, if you do it too much, like take it too far, the novelty sort of wears off after a while. So it would be, I guess, like you have to try and sort of not go too far all the time. And luckily, in our game, you have 4 playable characters, so you will not be looking at the same running loop all of the time. And then a quick little tip that I've sort of come to rely on a little bit is using loops within loops to hide the looping point. So this guy here, he has a walk cycle, and then he moves his head from side to side, and the head moving from side to side is sort of the longest loop. And then there are 2 loops of him walking, and then there's like a third small loop of his nose going back and forth. So it's a little bit harder to detect when the animation actually loops. And I find that like breaking it up like that, and also breaking it up with the overlapping actions, help like hide a little bit of how like sort of our system is pretty basic, but using those kind of tricks makes it look more complex than it really is. Okay, so I'm going to try and play the game a little bit, just to show one of our characters. Then I'll come back to the slides afterwards. Let's see, to press escape, and then... All right, so I just have to set up the volume before I start. And all right, so here's a very early level. And here you can see this character called Lumina. And she's a sorceress, like an electric sorceress, which we call a Teslamancer. And you can see like in her main movement loops, you can see those overlapping actions in her hood and her braids and her dress. And you can see that as she, wait, I have to fight these little foxes. You can see that as she accelerates, they like move more and more extreme overlapping. You can also notice in the little foxes they're jumping. Like the animation loop contains like 2 jumps, and then the tail swishes from side to side, so that like I'm hiding the looping point of the jump a little bit, so that it's like the animation seems a little bit more complex than it is. And also like the bouncing of the airs, the overlapping action there sort of helps to make it feel like a little bit more complex, a little bit more sophisticated. Like we don't use physics or anything to drive any of this. And I think like, of course, it would have been an interesting experiment, but we weren't comfortable trying to make that work with our limited resources. So this was sort of a working alternative. Okay, I'm going to go back to the slides now. Wait a minute, I have to just pause this. And okay, so I want to talk now about our main characters, which is where I focused the majority of the animation work. So we have 4 different playable characters, and they all have very different ability sets. They have very different play styles, different things you will do when you're playing them. And there's a big contrast between all 4 of them. And they also have very different story goals. Like their goals in the game are very different, at least to begin with. And they also have very strong personalities. So in the story, we sort of play them off each other. And we wanted the animation of the characters to reflect this sort of different points of view. Because like each character's point of view, the view of the world that they're in, is colored by their abilities. And I wanted to sort of, as a player, feel that every time you switch a character, I wanted to like see immediately as it was moving that it has a different sort of relationship with the world around it. So it started like out with some basic poses that I wanted each character to assume when they were like idles or as they were running. As you can see, like the smallest character, the kid, he's like a fearful character. He's afraid of the world around him, so he's like leaning back a little bit. And you see like his feet are more forward. And you see the sorcerer girl, she's more of a headstrong, no nonsense, goes straight at the target. So her head is like forward, she's ready for everything. And you have the Mindbender character, which we'll see later. She's more of a laid-back and self-confident adventurer. So she sort of leads with her hips, and she has like more of a rolling hips walk that reflects her sort of self-confidence. And finally, we have the big brawler character who sort of leads with his chest. He's like a brave, very brave character. He's also not super smart, but like his movements are always he wants to like hit things with his chest. So he just struts around, showing off his muscles, basically. So like I talked about exaggeration, I wanted all those sort of personality of the character to be sort of exaggerated in the walk cycles, even though like I know that sort of can be a risky thing to do because you can get tired of watching it. I wanted like to have the confidence of this Mindbender character show off in her walking. Likewise, I wanted like the faces of the characters to sort of change slightly as they were moving to show off like the facets of their personality. So this guy, as he's just standing around, this looks very happy. As soon as you start moving, it gets a little more, let's say, agitated. And as he goes into like his attack mode, he gets really angry. So you have these sort of slight changes to his face. Not very big ones, but like I think it's fun to play around with it as you're playing to make him move at different speeds and like see his expression change, and that you as a player are in control of it. So I'm going to switch over again to the game. And I want to just show you the 4 characters. Like how they compare to each other a little bit, like the part I've been talking about. And that's it. Oh, sorry. I have to go back to the main menu. Right. I'm going to choose this guy. Okay, so here you have the big brawler. He's, you can see as I move him, you can see like his face expression changing slightly. And if I go into the charge, he like gets really angry. Oop. And I can punch, I can pick up these guys, throw them around. Let's see if I can fight one of the bigger enemies. So he basically just goes around the world punching stuff. That's his gameplay is inspired by old 90s brawler games. So he's sort of a one-dimensional type of character, but it's also like the butt of joke fall guy. Let's see. And if I switch to one of the others, like for example her, I can see that now she has a different approach to the world. So she can control all of the different monsters. She's pretty confident. She's not afraid of them, but she can't control them. And of course, if she gets too close, they can hit her. Just gonna try to separate them out. And then you can get to sort of play around with, when you control her, you can get to play around with all of the different creatures, which I think is really fun. You can see they, let's see if we can get it to do, yeah. They all have like different little abilities that you can take advantage of. Let's see if we can. Like this guy, for example, he's a fetcher, so he can fetch stuff for you. This sort of all affects the Mindbender's approach to the world. She solves puzzles like indirectly, not through fighting directly with creatures, but through controlling them and using their abilities to her advantage. And finally, we have a little kid. I'm gonna switch over into controlling him, and he's sort of helpless in the world. So, like his motions are very skittish. It's very fast, jumpy, so that he looks a little bit scared. Even his idol is sort of a little bit nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. But he can do other things like avoid danger by digging into the ground and just by bypassing danger altogether. And later in the game, he gets this. Oops! I found the bug. Yeah, this game it's still in development, so there are some bugs. But he can ice skate on the ground. He has this technology that allows his skates to generate ice for him. Okay. Switching back. If there are any questions from the stream, I can ask them now. Let's see. Yeah. Excuse me, I heard. Yeah. Well, starting doing the overlap is like usually pretty late. I start doing the all the timing and like the main motions of the character first, and then like at the end, because I usually save it to the end because then I know what motions that I'm able to prioritize. Because very often, like there's just a few of them that I'm able to actually add it to, so I will wait till after most of the motions are implemented in the game, and then I will add like overlapping action to things. So it's like the last, probably sort of the last step. Yeah, and I try to use some like simple tricks, like. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. Which bones? All right. So I guess the question is which bones tend to overlap on a character, and it's anything that isn't moved by a muscle, basically. Like so, clothing, right? That would move like in relationship with the arm that is covering, but it wouldn't have its own energy to move with. So it would like be moved by the arm. Anything that's moved by a muscle sort of is not an overlapping action, in my opinion at least. Unless, of course, the arm is dangling and it's not moved by the muscles in the arm, then the arm could be an overlapping action. So it really sort of depends on what you're trying to do. Sometimes you want arms that are dangling, so that would be an overlap, technically. Did I answer the question? Mm. Yep. Yeah. So the loops within loops thing is not animation layers per se. I'm guessing that you're referring to some technical thing in Maya, maybe. It's basically just instead of making a single walk cycle loop, for example, if I can just jump back to that a little elephant. Instead of making looping the animation at the first 4 steps, I make an additional 4 steps. So there's 8 steps, like 1 for each, 2 for each leg, and then I make the head move back and forth once as those 8 steps are taken. So it's basically one long loop, and then there are 2 loops for each of the legs, and then there is 4 maybe more loops for the nose moving back and forth, like he's sniffing the ground. So it's not like a technical thing. It's basically just me, you taking advantage of dividing the timeline. That makes sense? Sometimes I go to side view for walk cycles, just for simplicity, but I tend to animate in 3D space mostly. I actually use a software called Blender, which is an open source 3D animation software, and has some good hotkeys for constraining your controllers to one axis at a time. So then I will just constrain to the y-axis, for example, to know that I'm in a 2D plane first. But I like to be able to see the animation in 3D as much as possible. And of course, for this game, a lot of the animation was actually done top-down to sort of make sure that it would look primarily good from a top-down perspective. And I would look at it from side views also, of course, but I would try to always check does it look good from above. So some of the animations actually look a little bit weird when you see them from the side, like here. But when you see them in the game, they tend to look a little bit better, in my opinion. Okay, I don't know if I have that much more time. I have a few points I'd like to make about how the animation pipeline we had worked. Basically, I'm the entire character pipeline because I do all of those jobs up until I don't do the actual implementation in the engine, but I do a lot of the design work, and I do a lot of the characters, the modeling, and the texturing, and the rigging, and the animation. And of course, that sort of means that I have to sort of do some of those steps pretty fast. So the textures of the game are very simple. They're just color textures, and no normal maps or no specular maps or anything like that. And then we use the Blender files directly in Unity, because Unity can just natively import Blender files, which is useful. But we had to write some of our own tools for re-importing models, because we work sort of iteratively. We update models constantly. And when you do that, especially if you update the rig, Unity cannot just simply re-import the animation. It has to take an entirely new version of the rig into the system, and then you have to hook up all your scripts again. So we had to write some of our own tools to make it simpler to edit the rigs. This is a problem that comes with me being inexperienced at rigging. So I didn't know what. Maybe for a lot of the rigs, I didn't know what I was doing, and then I did it wrong, and I had to fix it after the fact, and then we got into a lot of trouble. So yeah, some our own tools was just necessary. Yeah, and we tried to always make the gameplay come first. We didn't do almost any custom cutscene animations for this game at all. It was all just a simple scripting system with some emotes that the characters are doing during dialogue scenes. Because we wanted to spend as much time possible making sure that the gameplay was fun and smooth and responsive, for the player. And we knew our philosophy is that is the part that is most important, and that will give the greatest return on investment of time, basically. Yeah. like I said, this is what I mentioned earlier. Like, spend your time on those assets that are going to be seen the most. Because, like I did with this animation here, I spent a lot of time animating this very early on in the project, and almost nothing of that is in the game. Like, just a tiny loop at the end is actually in the game. And I spent a lot of time polishing that for no reason. Like, that was pretty, not time well spent. But it was, okay, it was while I was experimenting with the character, so it was like a bit of discovering the character, but yeah. Right now, I would probably spend my time differently. And yeah, keeping hold of your vision while you're having to like deal with all of these like technical issues and all of these like time constraints can be hard. But I try to think that every animation loop that I make is like an opportunity to present the character, like present his personality, to make it interesting. And I think it's like important to, even if you have a very little amount of time, try to see if you can make it not like don't just make it move well, but make it move in a way that like represents that character. So the example here is the fighting stance. So the brawler guy, he's like, I wanted to make him look a little bit like a bear, like sort of animalistic. So I had like his hand opening and closing like it's a claw, and stamping his feet like a bear standing on his hind legs. Okay, so the last points here are about the animation process, like where we go from start to finish. So our starting points would be like a rough gameplay idea that would usually come from our lead designer, or sometimes from our art director actually, who has some ideas for gameplay as well. And then we would, for example, create a monster or something and determine what kind of relationship it would have to the player characters and have some loosely defined features. And then we would like develop the animations and the gameplay sort of in tandem, side by side. And I would deliver my animations to, like very rough animations, to the gameplay programmer as they were ready. But first I would like experiment a little bit with how the creature would behave. So this here is the Gru, and it's a monster that sort of it's supposed to be a terrifying monster, but to sort of make a contrast to the terrifying part, like his sort of base movements and the things he does when he's not chasing the player is like he's looking sort of more like a friendly dog, and then it changes into wolf mode like when he sees the player. So he has like these sort of two personalities that come through. And I like the little switch, the point where like he switches into being something else. It's like that makes it more scary in my opinion. That is like not always just terrifying, but it has this little change. Oh yeah, I already talked about this, and that's it. If there's any more questions, if we have time, I don't know. Yeah. Okay, thanks for watching. You can find me on Twitter like show here, and this is the web page of our game. I'd like to thank Mike and all the people at the Animation Exchange for having me, and yeah, have a good evening.